Millionaire tips a waitress $150 and sees her pendant. The same one he gave his daughter before she disappeared 20 years ago. David Reynolds leaned back in his leather chair, loosening his tie as the weight of the day pressed heavily on his shoulders. Another deal closed, another mountain of paperwork signed. His life was a relentless cycle of meetings, decisions, and numbers. That night, instead of returning to his penthouse, he craved something different, something quieter. He found himself wandering into a small, unassuming restaurant tucked away in a corner of Manhattan. The place wasn't what he was used to. No polished marble floors or hushed tones of a high-end establishment. Instead, there was a cozy warmth to the dimly lit space. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the savory aroma of food. A soft hum of conversation filled the room, broken occasionally by the clinking of cutlery. As he slid into a booth, a young waitress approached. "Good evening, sir. My name's Megan. Can I get you started with something to drink?" David glanced up, and for a brief moment, he was caught off guard. The girl couldn't have been older than 23, with a genuine smile and bright eyes that radiated an earnest charm. Her uniform was a little oversized, her auburn hair loosely tied back. She looked tired but cheerful, the kind of person who seemed determined to do her best no matter what. "I'll have a black coffee," David replied curtly, not in the mood for small talk. Megan nodded, jotting it down on her notepad. "Coming right up." As she walked away, David's gaze followed her for a second longer than he intended. Something about her reminded him of, no, it couldn't be. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. When Megan returned with his coffee, David ordered a simple steak dinner. He watched as she moved efficiently between tables, balancing plates and refilling drinks. Her energy and determination were striking, even if she was just serving food. When his meal arrived, David ate in silence. Lost in thought, the restaurant's ambiance, with its unpretentious charm, provided a rare moment of peace in his otherwise chaotic world. As he finished his meal, he glanced at Megan, who was clearing a nearby table. "Miss," he called out. Megan turned, slightly startled, and approached his table. "Yes, sir." David reached for his wallet and pulled out a $150 bill. "For your service," he said, handing it to her. Her eyes widened. "Oh, wow, sir, Thank you so much, you didn't have to." As she leaned slightly to take the money, the pendant around her neck slipped out from beneath her uniform. It dangled for just a moment, a small star-shaped pendant on a delicate chain. But that brief glimpse was enough to freeze David in place. His breath hitched. The room seemed to blur around him as his focus zeroed in on that pendant. He'd seen it before, 20 years ago. He had given that exact pendant to his daughter, Sophie, on her 5th birthday. It had been her favorite piece of jewelry, something she wore every day. Where did you get that?" David's voice cracked, his usual composure shattered. Megan blinked, confused. It's just something I've always had. I don't know where it came from." "Why?" David's hand trembled as he gestured for her to sit. "Please, can I see it up close?" Hesitant but sensing his sincerity, Megan unclasped the necklace and handed it to him. David examined it with shaking fingers, turning it over to reveal the faint engraving on the back. "To my little star. Love, Dad." "It can't be," David muttered under his breath, tears welling in his eyes. "Where did you say you got this?" "I don't really know," Megan said cautiously. "I've had it since I was little. I was told I was found near a car accident when I was 3. This necklace was with me." David's mind raced. 20 years ago, his wife and daughter had been in a tragic car accident. His wife's body was found, but Sophie's wasn't. Authorities had presumed she'd been swept away by the river near the crash site. Now, sitting before him, was a young woman with the same pendant he had given to Sophie. Could it be her? Could his daughter have survived all these years? Megan shifted uncomfortably under his intense gaze. "Sir, is everything okay?" David inhaled deeply, struggling to steady his emotions. "Megan, I need to speak with you again. This is important. Would you meet me for dinner tomorrow? I'll explain everything then." She frowned but nodded. Curiosity and concern etched on her face. "All right, I'll finish my shift at 6. David stood, clutching the pendant tightly in his hand as he exited the restaurant. The cool night air hit him like a wave. His heart pounded with a mix of hope and fear. Could he have just found the daughter he thought he'd lost forever? David couldn't sleep that night. The memory of Megan's pendant haunted him, stirring emotions he hadn't felt in decades. His mind raced through fragments of the past. Sophie's laughter, her tiny hands clutching his as they crossed the street. The way she used to twirl around the living room wearing that very necklace. For years, he had convinced himself she was gone. But now, doubt seeped into every corner of his thoughts. By morning, David had made up his mind. He needed answers. His first stop was his office, where he had a private investigator on retainer. Normally, David would have called his assistant to set up a meeting, but this was different. Too personal, too urgent. "Mr. Reynolds, good to see you." The investigator, Alan Porter, greeted him. Alan was an older man with sharp eyes and a reputation for solving the unsolvable. "What can I help you with?" David slid a photo across the desk. It was an old picture of Sophie wearing the star pendant, taken just a few weeks before the accident. "I need you to find everything you can about a young woman named Megan Taylor. She works at a restaurant in Manhattan. I believe she might be connected to someone I lost a long time ago." Alan studied the photo and nodded. "I'll start right away." As Alan began his work, David felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Part of him feared he was clinging to false hope, but another part, the part that had never stopped grieving, whispered that this was real. That evening, David arrived at the restaurant an hour early, unable to sit still at home. The cozy atmosphere was the same, but now it held a deeper significance. He chose a corner booth where he could watch the door, his heart racing every time someone walked in. At exactly 6 o'clock, Megan entered, still in her uniform but with a coat draped over her arm. She spotted David immediately and gave him a hesitant smile. "You're early," she said as she slid into the seat across from him. David offered a small smile. "I didn't want to risk being late." A waiter approached, but David waved him off. This wasn't a meal for distractions. "Megan," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Thank you for coming. I know this might seem strange, but I need to tell you something important." Megan leaned back, her curiosity evident. "All right, I'm listening." David reached into his pocket and pulled out the pendant she had given him the night before. Placing it gently on the table, he said, "This belonged to my daughter, Sophie. I gave it to her when she was 5 years old. She wore it every day until she disappeared." Megan's expression softened, though confusion lingered in her eyes. "I'm sorry, but I don't know how this could have ended up with me. Like I told you, I've had it since I was a child. Do you remember anything about the accident you mentioned?" David asked, leaning forward. Megan hesitated as if searching her memory. "Not really. I was too young. I only know what I was told, that I was found near a crashed car on a rural road, and no one claimed me. I grew up in the foster system." David clenched his fists under the table, his mind racing. It all lined up too perfectly. The timing, the location, the pendant. "I need to ask you for something, Megan," he said carefully. She tilted her head, her expression guarded. "What is it?" "A DNA test," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I know this is a lot to ask, but I believe you might be my daughter. The only way to know for sure is to confirm it scientifically." Megan's eyes widened, and she let out a nervous laugh. "Wait, what? You think I'm your daughter? This has to be some kind of mistake." David placed his hands on the table, palms up, a gesture of sincerity. "I know how it sounds. Believe me. I never thought I'd be having this conversation, but everything points to the possibility. And if there's even a chance, I have to know." Megan stared at him for a long moment, her emotions flickering between disbelief and cautious curiosity. "A DNA test, huh? And what if it says I'm not your daughter? Then what?" "Then I'll apologize for putting you through this and never bother you again," David said honestly. "But if it says you are, well, then we'll figure out what that means together." She exhaled deeply, running a hand through her hair. "This is crazy, but okay, I'll do it. What do I have to lose?" David's shoulders relaxed in relief. "Thank you, Megan. I'll arrange everything. You won't have to worry about a thing," as they left the restaurant. Megan couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet understand. David, on the other hand, walked away with a newfound determination. This wasn't just a possibility anymore. It felt like fate. David sat in his office the next morning, his hands trembling slightly as he held the lab paperwork. The DNA test had been expedited, thanks to his connections, and the results would arrive in a matter of hours. Each passing second felt like a lifetime, and his mind was filled with memories of Sophie, her laughter, her tiny footsteps echoing through their home, and the way her eyes lit up when she saw him. Megan had agreed to meet him again that evening, curious about the results, but trying not to get her hopes up. For her, this was still surreal. A man she had served coffee to just days ago now believed she could be his long-lost daughter. It felt like something out of a movie, but deep down, she couldn't ignore the strange pull she felt toward him. By midday, the email from the lab appeared in David's inbox. He hesitated before clicking it, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the sounds of the world around him. With a deep breath, he opened the file and scanned the results. The words, 99.9% probability of biological relationship, stared back at him. David froze, his eyes filling with tears as the weight of the revelation settled over him. Sophie was alive. She had been right in front of him, serving coffee, smiling, and wearing the necklace he had once clasped around her tiny neck. Without wasting a moment, David picked up the phone and called Megan. "Hi, it's David," he said, his voice shaking with barely contained emotion. "Can you meet me earlier today? I have the results." Megan paused on the other end. "That fast? Okay, sure, I can be there in an hour." When Megan arrived at David's office, she found him pacing by the window. The spacious room was a stark contrast to her own life. Polished floors, sleek furniture, and a view of Manhattan that stretched for miles. "Hey," she greeted, feeling out of place. "You sounded intense on the phone. Is everything okay?" David turned to face her, holding the envelope in his hand. His expression was a mixture of joy and vulnerability, emotions he rarely allowed anyone to see. "Megan, I got the results." She stepped closer, her nerves suddenly on edge. "And?" He handed her the paper, his hands trembling slightly. Megan unfolded it and read the results, her eyes widening as the meaning sank in. "So, this says, you're my dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. David nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. "It does, Megan. You're Sophie. You're my daughter." Megan's knees felt weak, and she sank into the nearest chair. Her whole world spun as she tried to process the information. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "You don't have to say anything," David said, sitting across from her. "I can't imagine what this must feel like for you, but for me, it's like a second chance. I thought I lost you forever, and now here you are." Megan looked down at the pendant still hanging around her neck. "I've always wondered about my parents. I used to make up stories when I was a kid, pretend they were secret agents or something. But this, I never expected anything like this." David smiled, a small laugh escaping despite the weight of the moment. "Sophie, Megan, you were always imaginative. Even as a little girl, you'd tell me these wild stories about what you wanted to be when you grew up." Hearing the name Sophie felt strange to Megan. It was like being handed an identity she wasn't sure she could claim. "This is a lot," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I mean, I've been Megan my whole life, and now you're telling me I'm Sophie. I know it's overwhelming," David said gently. "Take all the time you need. You don't have to make sense of everything right away. Just let me be here for you. Let me help you understand who you were and who you are." Megan nodded, though her mind was still spinning. "Okay, but I need to know something. If I'm Sophie, then what happened? How did I end up where I did?" David's smile faded slightly, replaced by a somber expression. "That's what I need to find out," he said. "The accident that took your mother, it was supposed to have taken you too, but you survived, and someone found you. That much is clear. What I don't understand is why no one ever contacted me. Why you ended up in the foster system instead of coming home to me." Megan bit her lip, the weight of his words sinking in. "Do you think someone kept me away from you on purpose?" David hesitated, but nodded. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but something about this doesn't feel right. I've spent 20 years believing you were gone, and now, finding out you were alive all along. It doesn't add up." The room fell silent as Megan tried to absorb everything. David reached out and placed a hand on hers. "No matter what, I'm here now, and I promise, we'll figure this out together." Megan looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of uncertainty and hope. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's find the truth." For the first time in years, David felt a glimmer of peace. He had found his daughter, and now they were about to uncover the secrets that had kept them apart for so long. David couldn't stop glancing at the pendant on Megan's neck as they walked out of his office that evening. The once distant possibility had now become reality. She was his Sophie, his little star, miraculously alive. Every step felt surreal, as if he were dreaming. Megan, on the other hand, was overwhelmed. Her life had always been a puzzle with missing pieces, and now, a man she had met days ago claimed to be the key to completing it. But even with the DNA results, accepting this truth wasn't as simple as flipping a switch. They stopped outside the building, where David's driver waited with the car. "Let me take you home," he offered gently. Megan hesitated. "You really don't have to." "I insist," David interrupted. "After everything you've been through, it's the least I can do." Reluctantly, Megan climbed into the sleek black car, the leather seats so luxurious they felt almost foreign. David gave the driver her address, and the car began gliding through the busy Manhattan streets. The drive was quiet at first, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. Megan finally broke the silence. "So, what happens now?" David turned to her, his face a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "That's up to you," he said honestly. "I don't want to rush you into anything, but I'd like to spend more time with you, answer your questions, and help you fill in the blanks about your past." Megan nodded slowly, her fingers brushing the pendant. "It's just, I've spent my whole life not knowing where I came from. Now I have answers, but it's like, I don't know what to do with them." David's heart ached at her words. "Take your time," he said. "This isn't just about me finding you. It's about you finding yourself too." When they arrived at Megan's apartment, she stepped out and turned to David. "Thanks for the ride and for everything, I guess." "Anytime," he said with a small smile. "And Megan, if you ever need anything, no matter how small, you call me, okay?" She nodded, offering a faint smile before heading inside. Over the next few days, David and Megan began to rebuild their bond. Step by step, David invited her to his home, a sprawling penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. Megan hesitated at first, intimidated by the sheer opulence, but David quickly put her at ease with stories of Sophie's childhood. "This was her room," he said softly, opening the door to a room that had been frozen in time. The walls were painted a soft lavender, adorned with framed photos and drawings Sophie had made. Toys sat neatly on shelves, untouched for 2 decades. Megan stepped inside, running her fingers over the desk. "It's like a museum," she murmured. David chuckled. "I could never bring myself to change it. It felt like erasing her." Megan turned to him, her voice tinged with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever be her Sophie. I mean, I've been Megan for so long. It's all I know." David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to be anyone but yourself. Whether you're Sophie, Megan, or someone in between, you're my daughter. That's all that matters." His words struck a chord, and for the first time, Megan felt a flicker of acceptance. As their connection deepened, David shared more memories of Sophie and her mother. Megan listened intently, piecing together fragments of a life she barely remembered. But the more David shared, the more questions surfaced about the accident that had torn their family apart. "Do you remember anything strange about that day?" Megan asked one afternoon as they sat in David's living room. David frowned, the question pulling him into a sea of painful memories. "It was supposed to be a normal trip. Your mother and I were going to meet at a cabin upstate. She took you in the car while I handled some last-minute work. Hours later, I got the call about the crash." Megan watched him closely. "And no one ever found me. How is that even possible?" David shook his head. "I asked myself that question every day for years. The authorities said the river must have carried you away, but deep down, I never believed it. I even hired private investigators, but they all came up empty." Megan's brow furrowed. "So someone found me and just didn't tell you?" David's jaw tightened. "That's what doesn't make sense. Who would do that? And why?" The mystery weighed heavily on both of them. David couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, and Megan couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that her placement in the foster system hadn't been an accident. Determined to find answers, David made a decision. "I'm going to look into this," he told Megan. "There are too many loose ends. If someone kept you from me, I need to know who and why." Megan hesitated, her voice quiet. "What if we don't like what we find?" David met her gaze, his expression resolute. "Whatever we uncover, we'll face it together. I've already lost you once, Megan. I'm not losing you again." Megan nodded, her fear tempered by his determination. For the first time, she felt like she had someone in her corner, a father who was willing to move mountains for her. As the evening sky darkened, David stood by the window, gazing out at the city lights. The search for the truth wouldn't be easy, but he knew it was the only way to truly reunite with his daughter. The week passed in a blur of emotions and unanswered questions. Megan tried to settle back into her routine, but every shift at the restaurant felt heavier now. Her thoughts constantly drifted to David, to the revelations about her past, and to the mystery surrounding the accident. David, on the other hand, was relentless in his pursuit of answers. He had tasked Alan Porter, his private investigator, with uncovering every detail about the crash, the foster system, and anyone who might have been involved in keeping Megan from him. One evening, David called Megan and invited her over for dinner. She hesitated at first, worried about how much more emotional weight she could handle, but curiosity won out, and by 7 p.m., she was standing in David's penthouse once again, greeted by the warm glow of the city lights through the massive windows. "Thanks for coming," David said, his voice softer than usual. He had traded his usual suit for a more casual sweater and slacks, trying to make her feel more at ease. "Sure," Megan replied, offering a small smile. "What's this about? Did you find something?" David gestured toward the dining table, where a simple meal had been laid out. "Let's eat first, then we'll talk." Over dinner, David shared more stories about Sophie's childhood. He talked about the time she insisted on wearing her star-shaped pendant to bed, even though it left a tiny imprint on her skin. Megan couldn't help but laugh, imagining herself as that stubborn little girl. As the meal wound down, David's tone grew more serious. "Megan, I need to tell you something," he began, his eyes locking onto hers. "What is it?" she asked, setting her fork down. "I've been digging into the accident. There are things that don't add up." Megan straightened in her chair. "Like what?" "For starters, the crash site," David explained. "The authorities said your mother's car lost control on a sharp turn and went into the river. But according to Alan's research, there were no skid marks on the road, no sign that she even tried to stop." Megan frowned, the weight of his words sinking in. "What does that mean?" "It means someone might have tampered with the car," David said grimly. "Your mother was a careful driver. She wouldn't have just driven off the road like that." The room fell silent as Megan absorbed this new layer of the mystery. "So, you think someone caused the accident?" David hesitated before nodding. "I don't have all the answers yet, but the more I look into it, the more it seems like this wasn't just a tragic accident. And if that's true, it would explain why you ended up in the foster system instead of back with me." Megan's heart raced. The idea that someone had deliberately torn her family apart was almost too much to process. "Do you think they knew I survived, that they kept me away on purpose?" "It's possible," David said. "I've seen enough in my life to know that greed and jealousy can drive people to do terrible things. But whoever it was, I promise you, we'll find them." The next day, David received a call from Alan. "I think I've found something," the investigator said. "What is it?" David asked, gripping the phone tightly. "I reviewed the accident reports and found some irregularities in the original investigation," Alan explained. "There were mentions of a witness, a truck driver who was one of the first on the scene, but his statement doesn't line up with the official report." David's heart sank. "What do you mean?" "The report claims the driver saw the car in the river and called for help. But according to his original statement, he said he saw another vehicle speeding away from the scene. That part was conveniently left out of the final documentation." David clenched his jaw. "Do you think this other car was involved?" "It's likely," Alan replied. "But here's the kicker. When I tried to track down the truck driver, I found out he died in an accident a year after the crash. His death was ruled as a hit and run, but no suspect was ever identified." David felt a chill run down his spine. It was as if every lead was met with another tragedy. "Keep digging," he said firmly. Someone wanted this buried, and I need to know who. Later that evening, David shared the findings with Megan. They sat together in his living room, the city lights twinkling in the distance. "A second car," Megan said, her voice filled with disbelief. "So someone was there when it happened." "That's what it looks like," David confirmed. "And the fact that the witness is dead, it's too much of a coincidence." Megan hugged her knees to her chest, her mind racing. "Why would someone want to hurt us? We weren't rich or powerful or anything like that." David hesitated. "That's not entirely true," he admitted. Megan looked at him, confused. "Your mother was part of a wealthy family," David explained. "She left that life behind when we got married. But there were people who didn't approve of us. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I wonder if that resentment ran deeper than I realized." Megan's eyes widened. "You think someone from her family did this?" "I don't know," David said, his voice heavy. "But it's a possibility I can't ignore." The room fell into a tense silence as father and daughter processed the implications of this discovery. "We'll find out the truth," David said finally, his voice firm. "Whoever did this, they're going to answer for it." Megan nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just uncovering her past. She was reclaiming it. The following days were a whirlwind of activity for David. Each new piece of information about the accident seemed to deepen the mystery. Alan's discoveries had left him restless, and now, he was determined to chase every lead no matter how obscure. Meanwhile, Megan found herself grappling with a mix of emotions. On one hand, she felt closer to David with each passing day. On the other, the more they uncovered about the accident, the more unsettling it became. Her past, which had always been a blank slate, was now being filled with shadows and unanswered questions. David invited her to his penthouse again, this time with the intent of sharing more details about his investigation. When Megan arrived, she noticed the tension in his expression immediately. "Something's wrong," she said, as she sat down across from him. David nodded, his hands clasped tightly. Alan found more inconsistencies in the reports from the day of the crash. "It's worse than we thought." Megan's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" David took a deep breath. There was a second car at the scene speeding away. The witness who saw it, the truck driver, died in suspicious circumstances shortly after giving his initial statement. "It looks like someone wanted to make sure his version of events never came to light." Megan stared at him, her mind racing. "So this wasn't just an accident. Someone caused it." David's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his anger. "It's looking that way, and whoever it was, they've been covering their tracks for years." Megan leaned back, running her hands through her hair. "But why? Who would want to hurt us?" David hesitated before answering. "I've been thinking about that. Your mother came from a wealthy family, a family that didn't approve of her marrying me. They saw me as an outsider, someone beneath them. After she left that life behind, there were tensions." Megan frowned. "You think one of them did this? To get back at you or something?" "I don't want to point fingers without evidence," David said carefully. "But it's a possibility I can't ignore." Determined to dig deeper, David called Alan later that evening. "I need you to focus on Evelyn's family," he said, referring to his late wife. "Look into her parents, siblings, anyone who might have had a motive to do something like this." Alan's tone was cautious. "Understood, but you should know. Digging into old family conflicts can open a lot of wounds." "I don't care," David replied. "I need answers." While Alan worked, Megan began to explore the memories she'd buried for years. She spent hours flipping through old photo albums David had kept, trying to connect with the life she'd lost. One evening, she stumbled upon a picture of a young woman she didn't recognize. "Who's this?" she asked, holding up the photo when David walked into the room. David's face darkened. "That's Melissa," he said. "My sister." Megan raised an eyebrow. "I don't think I've heard you mention her before." David sighed, sitting down beside her. "We haven't been close for a long time," she was. "Difficult, even when we were younger. Always competitive, always trying to prove something. After the accident, we drifted apart. I think she blamed me for what happened." Megan studied his expression, noting the pain behind his words. "Do you think she had something to do with it?" David shook his head quickly. "No, Melissa and I had our differences, but she loved Sophie. She wouldn't have hurt her. Still, Megan couldn't help but feel a flicker of doubt. Something about Melissa's absence from their recent conversations felt conspicuous. A few days later, Alan called with new information. "David, I've been looking into Evelyn's family, like you asked," he began. "There's something you should see." David met Alan in his office, where the investigator laid out a series of documents on the table. "These are financial records from around the time of the accident," Alan explained. "Evelyn's family's company was in trouble. They were on the verge of bankruptcy. But shortly after the crash, a large sum of money appeared in their accounts." David's eyes narrowed. "Where did it come from?" "That's the thing," Alan said. "The source is unclear. It's listed as a private donation, but the timing is suspicious. It's almost as if someone paid them off to stay quiet." David's mind raced. "You think they knew something about the accident?" "It's possible," Alan replied. "If they believed Evelyn's death, or Sophie's disappearance, could damage their reputation, they might have accepted money to keep the truth buried." David clenched his fists, anger boiling beneath the surface. "I need to talk to them," he said. Face to face. That evening, David shared the latest findings with Megan. She listened intently, her expression a mix of shock and anger. "So her family took money and just let me go?" she asked, her voice trembling. David placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We don't know that for sure yet, but if they were involved, we'll find out. I won't let anyone get away with this." Megan nodded, though her heart felt heavy. For so long, she had wondered about her parents, about the life she might have had. Now, the answers seemed darker than she ever imagined. As the night wore on, David found himself standing by the window, staring out at the city below. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but the picture they formed was far more sinister than he'd anticipated. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he murmured to himself, his resolve stronger than ever. The following morning, David woke up to a message from Megan. It was simple but carried a weight of vulnerability. "Can I come over later today? There's something I want to ask you." David replied immediately, telling her she was welcome any time. Though their bond was growing, he knew Megan was still navigating the complexities of their newfound relationship. He wanted to be patient, giving her space to adjust while also making it clear she was no longer alone. By early afternoon, Megan arrived at his penthouse. She was greeted by the scent of freshly brewed coffee and a tray of pastries David had set out, a small gesture to make her feel at home. "Thanks for coming," he said, smiling warmly. "Thanks for having me," Megan replied, sitting down on the couch. She fiddled with the chain of her pendant, her nerves evident. David poured her a cup of coffee and joined her. "What's on your mind?" Megan hesitated, her gaze fixed on the steaming cup in her hands. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About you, my mom, the accident, and the family I never got to know." David nodded, sensing where the conversation was headed. "I want to go to her grave," Megan said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like, if I'm really Sophie, I need to see it. I need to connect with her somehow." David's chest tightened at her words. Evelyn's grave had always been a sacred place for him, a quiet sanctuary where he mourned not just his wife, but the life they could have had. Sharing that with Megan felt both daunting and necessary. "Of course," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "We can go tomorrow, if you'd like." Megan looked up, relief and gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you." The next morning, the two drove out to the cemetery together. Megan stared out the window for most of the ride, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. She wasn't sure what she expected to feel. Grief, connection, closure, or perhaps nothing at all. When they arrived, David led her to a secluded area surrounded by tall, swaying trees. Evelyn's grave was simple but elegant, marked by a marble headstone etched with her name and the words, "Beloved wife and mother." Megan stood silently, her eyes fixed on the stone. For a moment, she felt like an intruder, unsure if she had the right to claim this part of her history. But then she noticed a small engraving at the bottom of the headstone. A star, identical to the pendant she wore. "She always said you were her little star," David murmured beside her, his voice thick with emotion. "When I designed this headstone, I wanted to make sure a part of you was here too, even when I thought you were gone." Megan's hand instinctively went to her pendant, her vision blurring with tears. She knelt down, running her fingers over the engraving. "I don't remember her," she whispered, "but I wish I did." David placed a hand on her shoulder. "She would have loved the woman you've become, and she would have fought for you, just like I'm fighting now." They stood there for a long time, the silence between them filled with unspoken emotions. That evening, back at the penthouse, Megan found herself flipping through the old photo albums again. She stopped at a picture of her mother holding her as a baby, both of them smiling brightly. "I look happy," Megan said aloud, more to herself than to David, who was sitting nearby. "You were," he replied, leaning over to look at the photo. "Your mother had this way of making everyone around her feel special. She used to call you her miracle baby." Megan raised an eyebrow. "Miracle baby." David chuckled softly. "She had some complications during her pregnancy. The doctors told us it might be difficult for her to carry you to term, but she was determined, and you arrived healthy and perfect." A small smile tugged at Megan's lips. "Sounds like she was stubborn." "She was," David agreed, his eyes distant as he reminisced. "But that's what made her so incredible." As the days passed, Megan and David began to settle into a tentative rhythm. Megan started spending more time at the penthouse, drawn by the sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. She even accompanied David to his office one afternoon, curious about his world. "This is overwhelming," Megan admitted as she stepped into the sleek, bustling space. David smiled. "It's not as glamorous as it looks, just a lot of meetings and paperwork." Megan smirked. "Still beats running around a diner during a lunch rush." David laughed, appreciating her humor. "Maybe one day you'll run this place. It's yours, you know, if you want it." Megan froze, caught off guard by the statement. "What do you mean?" "I mean, it's your legacy," David said simply. "Everything I've built was meant to provide for our family. For you. I know it's a lot to take in, but I want you to know the option is there." Megan looked away, unsure how to respond. She wasn't ready to think about inheriting an empire, especially when she was still figuring out who she was. Later that evening, as they shared dinner, Megan brought up a question that had been lingering in her mind. "What about Melissa?" she asked cautiously. David's expression darkened. "What about her? You said she blamed you for the accident," Megan said. "Do you think she's hiding something?" David sighed, setting down his fork. "I don't want to believe that, but the truth is, Melissa and I haven't spoken in years. She distanced herself after everything happened. I always thought it was grief, but now, I'm not so sure." Megan nodded thoughtfully, her instincts telling her there was more to Melissa's story. "We'll figure it out," David said firmly, meeting her gaze. "No matter what, we'll uncover the truth." Megan felt a flicker of hope at his words. For the first time, she didn't feel alone in her search for answers. David hadn't thought about Melissa in years. Their estranged relationship had become just another painful chapter in a life filled with loss. But as Megan's questions lingered in his mind, he began to wonder if his sister's actions following the accident had been more deliberate than he'd allowed himself to believe. The next morning, he called Alan. "I need you to look into Melissa," he said bluntly. Alan hesitated. "Melissa Reynolds, your sister?" "Yes," David confirmed, his voice firm. "We haven't spoken in years, but there's something about her behavior after the accident that doesn't sit right with me. I want to know everything. Where she is, what she's been up to, and if she had any connection to the events surrounding Evelyn's death." Alan agreed without hesitation. Though David could sense his reluctance, investigating family was always complicated, and this case was no exception. Meanwhile, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of uncovering something big. Her conversations with David had stirred an unease in her, a sense that the pieces of the puzzle were inching closer together. But the picture they formed was far darker than she'd anticipated. One evening, she brought it up during dinner. "So, what's the deal with Melissa?" she asked, her tone casual but probing. David looked up from his plate, his expression guarded. "Why do you ask?" "You've talked about her a few times, but it's always vague," Megan said. "And if she was around back then, she must have been affected by everything that happened. Maybe she knows more than you think." David sighed, setting down his fork. "Melissa and I were close when we were younger, but things changed after the accident. She blamed me for what happened to Evelyn and you. I think she saw me as the one who tore the family apart. That doesn't make sense, Megan said, frowning. It wasn't your fault. She needed someone to blame, David replied. And I was the easiest target. After the funeral, she distanced herself. We haven't spoken in nearly 15 years. Megan leaned back in her chair, absorbing his words. Do you think she's hiding something? I don't know, David admitted. But Alan is looking into it if she knows anything about what happened. We'll find out. A week later, Alan called with an update. I've tracked down Melissa, he began. Where is she? David asked, gripping the phone tightly. She's living in upstate New York, Alan said. She owns a small art gallery. Seems like she's kept a low profile over the years. No major scandals. No public presence. But I did find something odd. What is it? There are significant financial transactions in her accounts from around the time of the accident, Alan explained. Large sums of money deposited from anonymous sources. They don't match her income from the gallery, and there's no clear explanation for where they came from. David's chest tightened. You think it's connected to Evelyn's family? It's possible, Alan said. The timing is too coincidental to ignore. But here's the kicker. Melissa withdrew nearly all of that money over the next few years, and there's no trace of where it went. David's mind raced. He had always assumed Melissa's bitterness stemmed from grief, but this raised the possibility of something far more sinister. Thank you, Alan, he said finally. I'll handle it from here. That evening, David sat across from Megan in the penthouse, his thoughts heavy. Melissa isn't just keeping her distance out of resentment, he said, his tone grim. Alan found irregularities in her finances, money that doesn't add up. Tied to the time of the accident. Megan's eyes widened. What does that mean? It means she might have been involved, David said, his voice tight. I don't want to believe it, but there's no other explanation for the money. Someone paid her off, and I need to find out why. Megan shook her head. Disbelief etched on her face. Why would she do that? She's your sister. I don't know, David admitted, but I'm going to find out. The next day, David drove to Melissa's gallery. The small building was nestled on a quiet street, its windows displaying vibrant paintings that seemed to contrast sharply with the tension building inside him. When he walked through the door, a bell chimed softly, and Melissa looked up from behind the counter. Her expression shifted from surprise to wariness as she recognized him. David, she said, her voice cool. What are you doing here? I need to talk to you, David said, his tone firm but controlled. Melissa sighed, motioning for him to sit. All right, let's get this over with. David sat across from her, studying her face. She looked older than he remembered, her once sharp features softened by time, but there was a guardedness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. I want to know the truth, he said bluntly. About the accident, about Evelyn, and about the money. Melissa's eyes narrowed. What money? The deposits in your account, David said. The ones that started after Evelyn died. Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. For a moment, Melissa didn't respond. Then she let out a bitter laugh. So, you're finally digging into the past. Took you long enough. David's jaw tightened. What are you hiding, Melissa? Nothing you don't already suspect, she said, leaning back in her chair. But if you think you're ready to hear it, you'd better be prepared for the truth. Her words sent a chill down David's spine. He had come looking for answers, but the look in Melissa's eyes told him that the truth would be far darker than he was prepared for. Melissa's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and foreboding. David leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. I'm ready, he said firmly, though his pounding heart betrayed the certainty in his voice. Melissa smirked, leaning back in her chair with an air of defiance. You think you're ready, but this isn't a story with heroes and villains, David. It's messy, and it'll ruin whatever perfect image you have of your life before Evelyn died. Tell me the truth, David pressed. No more games. For a moment, Melissa hesitated. Then, with a resigned sigh, she began. You remember how Evelyn's family didn't approve of your marriage, right? They thought she deserved better. Someone from the same class. Someone who wouldn't drag her down, as they like to say. David nodded, his fists clenching at the memory. I know they hated me, but what does that have to do with the accident? Melissa's gaze turned icy. It has everything to do with it. Evelyn's father, Henry, was the one who orchestrated it. He wanted her to leave you, to come back to the family and take her rightful place. When she refused, he decided to eliminate the problem. David's blood ran cold. You're saying Henry planned to kill her and Sophie? Melissa shook her head. No, the plan wasn't to kill her, just to scare her enough to make her come back. But things got out of hand. The car was tampered with, but they underestimated how dangerous that stretch of road was. When Evelyn lost control, it was too late. David stared at her, disbelief and fury building within him. And you knew this. All these years, you knew. Melissa's jaw tightened. I didn't know at first, but after the accident, Henry approached me. He offered me money. Hush money, essentially. He didn't want anyone looking too closely into what had happened. I was grieving, David. I'd just lost my sister and my niece. I wasn't thinking straight, and I took it. David rose to his feet, his voice trembling with anger. You took their blood money and stayed silent while I spent years mourning them. Do you have any idea what that did to me? To Sophie? Melissa flinched but held her ground. You think I'm proud of it. I've carried that guilt every day since. But it's not as simple as you think. Henry had connections. Power. If I had spoken up, he would have destroyed me. And you too. At the time, I thought keeping quiet was the only way to survive. David shook his head, his mind reeling. His mind. You could have told me. We could have fought him together. You don't get it, Melissa snapped. Henry didn't just want Evelyn gone. He wanted to ruin you. If I had gone against him, you'd have lost everything. I did what I thought was best, even if it was wrong. David left the gallery in a daze. His emotions a volatile mix of anger, betrayal, and grief. He couldn't fathom how Melissa could have justified her actions, how she could have kept such a devastating secret for so long. When he returned to the penthouse, Megan was waiting for him, her expression filled with concern. What happened? She asked. Standing as he walked in, David sank onto the couch, running a hand through his hair. Melissa knew, he said, his voice hollow. She knew everything. Megan's brow furrowed. What do you mean? She told me Evelyn's father orchestrated the accident, David explained, his words bitter. It was meant to scare her into leaving me, but it went too far, and Melissa took his money to stay quiet. Megan's face paled. Her own father, I don't even know what to say. I don't either, David admitted. But now that I know, I'm going to make sure the truth comes out. Henry isn't going to get away with this. The next day, David met with Alan to discuss their next steps. We need evidence, he said firmly. Something that ties Henry to the accident. Melissa's testimony won't be enough. He'll deny everything. Alan nodded. I've already started looking into his financial records. If he paid Melissa, there might be other transactions that lead back to the people who tampered with the car. Good, David said. And I want to confront him. If we can catch him off guard, he might slip. That's risky, Alan warned. Henry's a powerful man. He won't hesitate to protect himself. I'm not afraid of him, David said, his voice steely. He took everything from me. Now it's time for him to pay. Later that evening, David shared his plan with Megan. You're going to confront him? She asked, her voice tinged with worry. I have to, David said. This is about more than just us. He needs to be held accountable for what he did to your mother. Megan hesitated before nodding. I want to come with you. David looked at her, surprised. Megan, this could get dangerous. I don't care, she said firmly. This is my family too. I deserve to hear the truth face to face. David saw the determination in her eyes and knew there was no convincing her otherwise. All right, he said. We'll do it together. As the night wore on, father and daughter prepared themselves for the confrontation that lay ahead. The truth was within reach, but they both knew it would come at a cost. The morning of the confrontation arrived with a quiet intensity. David and Megan sat across from each other in the penthouse, the weight of what they were about to face pressing heavily on them. Are you sure you want to do this? David asked, his tone serious but gentle. Megan nodded without hesitation. I need to. If what Melissa said is true, then Henry destroyed my family. I want to look him in the eye when we confront him. David admired her resolve. though part of him wished she didn't have to endure this. "All right," he said, standing up. "Let's go." They arrived at Henry's estate later that afternoon. The grand mansion loomed before them, its towering gates and manicured gardens a stark reminder of the wealth and power Henry wielded. For a moment, Megan hesitated, feeling out of place in such an imposing setting. "Are you okay?" David asked, sensing her discomfort. She took a deep breath and nodded. "Let's do this." A butler greeted them at the door and led them to Henry's study, a lavish room filled with leather-bound books and antique furniture. Henry, a man in his late 70s with a commanding presence, looked up from his desk as they entered. His sharp eyes flicked between David and Megan, narrowing slightly. "David," he said smoothly, rising to his feet. "What a surprise. And who is this young woman?" "This is Megan," David said, his tone cold. "My daughter." Henry raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Your daughter, I thought she—" He trailed off, a faint smile curling at the corners of his mouth. "Ah, I see. This is about Evelyn." David's jaw tightened. "It's about the accident and the truth." Henry gestured for them to sit, his calm demeanor unsettling. "Please, have a seat, let's talk." "We're not here to play games," David said, remaining standing. "We know what you did. Melissa told us everything." Henry's smile faded, replaced by a hardened expression. "And what exactly did Melissa say?" "That you orchestrated the accident to scare Evelyn into leaving me," David said, his voice sharp with anger. "That you tampered with the car and put her life, and Sophie's life, in danger." Henry leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "You have no proof of these accusations, and I suggest you tread carefully, David. Slander can be a dangerous game." Megan stepped forward, her voice trembling with both fear and determination. "You might have covered your tracks, but we're going to uncover the truth. You won't get away with this." Henry's gaze shifted to her, and for the first time, his composure wavered. "You've inherited your mother's fire, I see." David slammed his hand on the desk, his patience snapping. "Don't you dare talk about her. You destroyed our family. You took everything from me, from Megan, and now you're going to face the consequences." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Henry let out a low chuckle. "You always were dramatic, David. But let me make one thing clear. You'll never find the proof you're looking for. You can dig all you want, but you'll come up empty-handed." David glared at him, his fists clenched. "We'll see about that." As they left the estate, Megan was visibly shaken. "He's not even sorry," she said, her voice filled with disbelief. "He acted like it was just another business deal." "That's exactly how he sees it," David said grimly. "People like Henry don't feel remorse. They see lives as chess pieces, something to sacrifice for their own gain." Megan clenched her fists, anger bubbling within her. "So what do we do now?" "We keep going," David said. "He's hiding something, and we're going to find it." That evening, Alan called with an update. "I've found something," he said, his tone urgent. David sat up straighter. "What is it?" "There's a name that keeps coming up in the financial records I've been reviewing," Alan explained. "A mechanic named Carl Dawson. He received multiple payments from one of Henry's shell companies around the time of the accident." David's heart raced. "You think he was the one who tampered with the car?" "It's a strong possibility," Alan said. "I've tracked him down to a small town in Pennsylvania. If you want answers, he's the man to talk to." David thanked Alan and hung up, his mind already racing with plans. The next morning, David and Megan set out for Pennsylvania. The drive was long, and the tension between them was palpable. Megan stared out the window, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. "Do you think he'll talk?" she asked quietly. David hesitated. "I don't know, but if he's involved, he might crack under pressure." When they arrived in the small town, they found Carl's garage tucked away on a quiet street. The building was old and weathered, the kind of place that had seen better days. As they entered, Carl looked up from under the hood of a car, his expression shifting to wariness when he saw them. "Can I help you?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "We need to talk," David said, his tone firm. Carl narrowed his eyes. "About what?" "About a job you did 20 years ago," David replied. "For Henry Carter." The color drained from Carl's face, and he took a step back. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, David pressed, stepping closer. You tampered with Evelyn Reynolds' car, and you're going to tell us everything. Carl's hands trembled, and for a moment it seemed like he might deny it again. But then he let out a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping in defeat. All right, he said quietly. I'll tell you what I know, but you didn't hear it from me. David exchanged a glance with Megan, their shared determination stronger than ever. They were finally about to get the answers they'd been searching for. Carl Dawson sat heavily on a battered stool, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of his secret had been pressing down on him for years. He avoided David's piercing gaze and Megan's expectant eyes, focusing instead on the greasy rag in his hands. I shouldn't be telling you this, Carl muttered, his voice rough. If Henry finds out, he won't, David interrupted, his tone sharp. But if you don't tell us the truth, I'll make sure every investigator in the state comes knocking on your door, so start talking. Carl swallowed hard, nodding reluctantly. It was about 20 years ago, he began. Henry came to me with a job, said he needed a car. Adjusted. Adjusted how? Megan asked, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her. He wanted me to tamper with the brakes, Carl admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Not enough to cause a full failure, just enough to make the driver lose control if they were going too fast. Said it was supposed to be a scare tactic, nothing more. David's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. And you did it. Carl nodded, his guilt evident. Yeah, I did it. I needed the money. My garage was about to go under, and Henry paid me enough to keep it afloat for years. I didn't ask questions. I just did what he asked. Megan's voice wavered as she spoke. And when the accident happened, what did you do then? Carl hesitated, his hands trembling. I didn't know anyone had died until I saw it on the news. By then, Henry was already covering his tracks. He paid me again to keep quiet. Told me if I ever breathed a word, I'd regret it. David stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. Did you ever see Henry after that? Once, Carl said, his gaze darting nervously between David and Megan. About a year later, he wanted to make sure I wasn't talking. Told me the girl was gone, and that everything had worked out the way he planned. Megan's heart sank at his words. He thought I was dead, she murmured, her hands gripping the edge of the table for support. Carl looked at her, regret flickering in his eyes. I didn't know there was a kid involved, I swear, if I had known. You still went through with it, David snapped. You still put their lives in danger for a paycheck. I know, Carl said, his voice breaking. I've lived with that guilt every day since, but I can't change what I did. David glared at him, anger coursing through his veins. You're going to testify, he said. You're going to tell the authorities everything you just told us. Carl shook his head vehemently. No way. Henry will kill me if I do. David leaned in closer, his voice icy. If you don't, I'll make sure you go down for this alone. Henry won't protect you anymore, not when I'm involved. Carl hesitated, the fear in his eyes warring with the weight of his guilt. Finally, he nodded. All right, I'll testify, but you'd better protect me, because once this gets out, I'm a dead man. The drive back to New York was silent, the tension in the car almost unbearable. Megan stared out the window, her thoughts a chaotic mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. He planned it, she said quietly. Breaking the silence, David glanced at her. What? Henry planned all of it, she continued, her voice trembling. He didn't care who got hurt, as long as it got him what he wanted. And now, after all these years, he's still living his life like nothing happened. David gripped the steering wheel tightly. Not for much longer. Carl's testimony is the key we need to bring him down. Once he tells the authorities what happened, Henry will finally face justice. Megan nodded, but the weight of the truth was crushing. She had spent years wondering about her past, imagining the parents she had lost. Now, she knew the truth, and it was far uglier than she had ever expected. The next day, David and Megan met with Alan to discuss their next steps. Carl had agreed to testify, and Alan had already begun coordinating with a legal team to ensure his safety. This is it, Alan said, laying out the plan. With Carl's testimony and the financial records we've gathered, We have enough to take Henry down, but you need to be prepared. He's not going to go down without a fight." David nodded, his determination unwavering. "Let him fight, I'm not backing down." Megan glanced at her father, her respect for him growing with each passing day. Despite everything he had endured, he was standing strong, ready to face the man who had taken everything from him. Later that evening, Megan found herself in the penthouse's living room, staring at a photograph of her mother. She traced the edges of the frame with her fingers, her mind racing with memories she couldn't quite grasp. "I wish you were here," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I wish you could tell me what to do." David entered the room, his expression softening when he saw her. "You okay?" he asked gently. Megan nodded, though tears glistened in her eyes. "I'm just thinking about her, about everything we've lost." David sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We can't change the past," he said quietly, "but we can make sure the people who took her from us are held accountable, and we can honor her by moving forward, together." Megan leaned into him, drawing strength from his presence. "We'll get through this," she said. "No matter what." David nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Together, as the city lights twinkled outside, father and daughter prepared themselves for the battle ahead. The truth was finally within reach, and they were ready to face it, no matter the cost. The courtroom was quieter than Megan had expected. She sat beside David in the gallery, her hands folded tightly in her lap as they waited for the hearing to begin. Carl Dawson, the man whose testimony could change everything, sat at the front of the room, fidgeting nervously. David placed a reassuring hand on Megan's. "Whatever happens today, we're one step closer to justice," he said softly. Megan nodded, though the weight of the moment pressed heavily on her. It wasn't just about the case. It was about confronting the truth of her family's betrayal. When Henry entered the courtroom, escorted by his team of high-profile lawyers, the air seemed to shift. He walked with the same commanding presence he had always exuded, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression calm and unreadable. David's jaw tightened as their eyes met. For a moment, there was a flicker of something unspoken between them, a mixture of anger, pain, and long-buried history. The judge called the court to order and the proceedings began. Carl was called to the stand, his voice trembling as he recounted the events of 20 years ago, every detail. Henry's request to tamper with Evelyn's car, the payments, and the aftermath, was laid bare for the room to hear. Megan listened intently, her emotions churning with every word. She glanced at Henry, who sat motionless, his expression giving nothing away. When Carl finished his testimony, Henry's lead attorney rose to cross-examine him. "Mr. Dawson," the lawyer began smoothly, "isn't it true that you've had financial difficulties for years? That you've been desperate for money?" Carl shifted uncomfortably. Yeah, but that doesn't change what happened. And isn't it also true that you've been offered financial incentives for your testimony today?" The lawyer pressed, his tone sharp. "No," Carl shot back. "I'm here because it's the truth. I'm trying to make things right." The lawyer smirked, turning to the jury. "The truth, Mr. Dawson? Or are you just trying to save your own skin?" David clenched his fists, anger boiling within him. He could see what the defense was doing, trying to discredit Carl, painting him as an unreliable witness. But he refused to let Henry's team manipulate the narrative when the court adjourned for the day. Megan and David stepped outside, the tension between them palpable. "They're trying to twist everything," Megan said, frustration evident in her voice. "That's what they do," David replied. "But we have more than just Carl's testimony. The financial records tie Henry to the payments. They can't dismiss that." As they spoke, a figure approached them from across the courthouse steps. Megan recognized her immediately. "Melissa, what are you doing here?" David asked, his tone cold. "I needed to see you," Melissa said, her expression guarded. "We need to talk." David glanced at Megan before nodding. "Fine, let's talk." They found a quiet corner near the courthouse. Away from prying eyes, Melissa hesitated before speaking, her voice low. "I know you're angry with me. You have every right to be. But I came here because I want to help." "Help," David repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. "You've already done enough, don't you think?" Melissa flinched at his words but pressed on. "I can testify against Henry. I have information that could back up Carl's testimony and prove Henry's involvement. David stared at her, his disbelief evident. Why now? Why not 20 years ago, when it would have mattered most? Because I was scared, Melissa snapped, her voice cracking. You think I haven't regretted it every day since? I was weak, David, but I'm here now, and I want to make it right. Megan stepped forward, her voice steady. If you really want to help, then do it. Testify. Tell the truth, no matter what it costs you. Melissa met her niece's gaze, a flicker of shame and determination in her eyes. I will, she said quietly. I owe that much to Evelyn, and to you. The following day, Melissa took the stand. Her testimony was both damning and emotional. She confirmed everything Carl had said, adding details about Henry's motivations and the lengths he had gone to in order to cover up his actions. Henry was obsessed with control, Melissa said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. He couldn't stand the idea of Evelyn living her own life, making her own choices when she married David. It was the final straw. He thought he could scare her into coming back, but he underestimated how strong she was. She refused to bow to him, and it cost her everything. David listened, his emotions a whirlwind of anger and sorrow. He'd always known Henry was a manipulative man, but hearing the extent of his cruelty was almost too much to bear. Megan sat beside him, her hand gripping his tightly. She could feel the tension radiating from him, but she also saw the glimmer of relief in his eyes. The truth was finally coming to light. When the court recessed for the day, David and Megan found themselves alone with Melissa. Why did you do it? David asked, his voice heavy with emotion. Why didn't you tell me the truth? Melissa looked down, unable to meet his gaze. Because I was a coward, she admitted. I let my fear control me, and I betrayed you. I'll never be able to undo that, but I hope you can forgive me someday. David didn't respond immediately. The pain of her betrayal still lingered, but he could see the sincerity in her eyes. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said honestly, but I appreciate what you did today. It might finally bring us justice. Megan looked between them, her heart aching for the fractured family before her. What happens now? She asked. David straightened, his resolve clear. Now, we make sure Henry pays for what he did, no matter what. As they left the courthouse, the weight of the day lingered in the air, but for the first time, David and Megan felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was out, and justice was finally within their grasp. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back walls, their cameras clicking furiously as the case against Henry Carter continued to unravel. The weight of Melissa's testimony, combined with the financial evidence Alan had uncovered, left the defense scrambling to maintain control. Henry, once the embodiment of power and composure, now looked visibly strained, his jaw clenched as the prosecution laid out the case piece by piece, exposing his actions to everyone present. Megan sat beside David, her hands gripping the edge of the bench as the prosecutor delivered the final blow. We've proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Henry Carter orchestrated this accident, not only endangering the lives of Evelyn Reynolds and her daughter, but also manipulating the aftermath to cover up his actions. His greed and lust for control have left a trail of devastation, and today, justice demands accountability. The prosecutor turned to the jury, their expressions a mixture of disgust and determination. We urge you to hold him responsible for the lives he's destroyed. The jury deliberated for hours, and the tension in the courthouse was palpable. David and Megan stayed close, their silence filled with anticipation and fear. Melissa sat nearby, her gaze distant, as if she were grappling with the weight of her own guilt. When the jury finally returned, everyone held their breath. The foreman stood, the room falling into a tense hush. We, the jury, find the defendant, Henry Carter, guilty on all counts. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Megan felt her chest tighten, tears welling in her eyes as the verdict sank in. Henry, the man who had stolen so much from her, would finally face the consequences of his actions. David exhaled deeply, the tension in his body giving way to relief. Justice had been served, but the victory felt bittersweet. Nothing could bring Evelyn back, and no amount of punishment could erase the years Megan had lost. Henry's reaction was cold and defiant, even as the bailiff approached to escort him away. He turned to David and sneered. You think this changes anything? You'll never get those years back. David met his gaze, his voice steady. No, I won't. But you'll spend the rest of your life paying for what you've done. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed, their questions relentless as they pushed microphones toward David and Megan. "How does it feel to finally get justice?" one reporter asked. David glanced at Megan, who gave him a small nod. He stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "Today's verdict is a step toward closure, but it doesn't erase the pain my family has endured. Evelyn was a loving wife and mother, and Megan was robbed of a childhood with her family. Henry Carter's actions were unforgivable, and we're grateful the truth has come to light. This isn't just about us. It's about accountability and ensuring no one else suffers the way we have." The reporters continued shouting questions as David and Megan walked away, choosing to let their silence speak for itself. That evening, back at the penthouse, David and Megan sat together, the weight of the day finally catching up to them. "It's over," Megan said quietly, staring out at the city lights. "He's going to prison." David nodded, his gaze distant. "It's over, but it doesn't feel like a victory. We've lost so much, and nothing can change that." Megan reached for his hand, her voice steady. "But we still have each other, and we have the truth now. That has to count for something." David squeezed her hand, a small smile breaking through the exhaustion on his face. "It does, and I'm so proud of you, Megan. You've been stronger than I ever could have imagined." Megan looked at him, her eyes shining with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you. You've fought so hard for me, for us. Thank you." In the days that followed, the story dominated the news cycle. Henry's conviction sent shockwaves through the business world, and his fall from grace was met with both outrage and satisfaction. Melissa, however, chose to retreat from the spotlight. She visited David and Megan one last time before leaving town. "I need to go," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "There's too much history here, too much pain. I need to start over somewhere else." David nodded, understanding her need for distance. "I hope you find peace, Melissa." She looked at Megan, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. "I'm sorry for everything," she said softly. Megan nodded, her voice quiet but firm. "I believe you, and I hope you can forgive yourself someday." Melissa's eyes filled with tears as she hugged them both, then walked out the door, leaving behind the fractured remnants of their family. Despite the resolution of the case, David and Megan knew their journey was far from over. There were still scars to heal, wounds that would take time to close. But for the first time in years, they felt a sense of hope, a belief that they could rebuild what had been broken. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Megan turned to David with a small smile. "You know, I've been thinking," she said, "maybe it's time I start figuring out what's next for me, what kind of life I want to build." David smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "Whatever you choose, I'll be right here to support you. You have the world ahead of you, Megan, and you've earned every bit of it." Megan nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I think I want to start by helping people. Kids who grew up like me in the foster system. Maybe I can make a difference for them." David's smile widened. "Your mother would be so proud of you, and so am I." As they sat together, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, they knew that while the past would always be a part of them, the future was theirs to shape. The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind of change, with Henry Carter sentenced to life in prison. The ripple effects of his downfall began to reshape the lives of everyone he had touched. For David and Megan, the verdict marked the beginning of a new chapter. But the path forward was far from clear. Megan found herself in uncharted territory. For most of her life, she had worked tirelessly to survive, never pausing to think about what she truly wanted. Now, with the weight of the past lifted, she felt both liberated and uncertain. One afternoon, as she sat in the penthouse flipping through an old photo album, David joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea. "You've been quiet today," he said, handing her a cup. Megan smiled faintly, just thinking, "It's strange, you know. I've spent so long wondering about my past, and now that I know the truth, it's like I don't know what to do with myself." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's normal. You've been through a lot, Megan, but you don't have to figure everything out right away. Take your time." She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've been so supportive through all of this. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." David smiled warmly. "You don't owe me anything. You're my daughter, and I'm just grateful we found our way back to each other. over the next few weeks, Megan began exploring new opportunities, inspired by her experiences. She reached out to organizations that supported foster children, sharing her story and offering to volunteer. One day, after a meeting with a local nonprofit, she returned to the penthouse, her excitement palpable. "I think I found something I'm passionate about," she told David as she set her bag down. "Oh," he said, looking up from his laptop. "There's this program that helps kids aging out of the foster system transition into independent living," Megan explained. "They teach them life skills, help them find jobs, and even provide mentorship. I want to be part of it." David's face lit up with pride. "That's incredible, Megan. I think you'd be perfect for that." She hesitated, her smile faltering slightly. It's a little intimidating. I've never done anything like this before." David reached for her hand, his voice steady. "You've overcome so much, Megan. You're stronger than you realize. And if this is what you want to do, I know you'll make a difference." Her confidence grew with his encouragement. And soon, Megan found herself fully immersed in her new role. Meanwhile, David began taking steps to reconnect with himself. For years, his life had been defined by loss and the relentless pursuit of justice. Now, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in decades. One evening, as they shared dinner, Megan noticed a lightness in his demeanor. "You seem different," she observed. David chuckled. "That's probably because I finally feel like I can breathe again. For so long, I carried this guilt and grief, thinking I'd failed you and your mother. But now, knowing the truth and having you back in my life, it's like I've been given a second chance." Megan smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. "You deserve it, Dad. You've done so much for me, for us. It's time you let yourself be happy." David looked at her, his eyes shining with emotion. "Having you back is more than I ever thought possible. And seeing you find your purpose, it's the greatest gift I could ask for." As time passed, Megan and David grew closer, their bond strengthening with each shared moment. They visited Evelyn's grave together, bringing fresh flowers and spending quiet afternoons reflecting on her memory. One day, as they stood by the headstone, Megan turned to David. "Do you think she'd be proud of us?" David smiled softly. "I know she would. She always believed in the strength of our family, even when things were difficult. And seeing how far we've come, I think she'd be proud of both of us." Megan nodded, a sense of peace washing over her. "I wish I could remember more about her, but I feel like I know her through you." David placed a comforting arm around her. "She's always with us, Megan, in the way we live, in the choices we make. And as long as we carry her in our hearts, she'll never be gone." In the months that followed, Megan thrived in her new role, mentoring young adults and helping them navigate the challenges of independence. Her story inspired those she worked with, showing them that resilience and hope could overcome even the darkest circumstances. David, meanwhile, began to step back from the relentless grind of his business empire. He started focusing on philanthropy, supporting causes that aligned with Megan's work and honoring Evelyn's legacy. Their lives were far from perfect, but they were filled with purpose and connection, a stark contrast to the isolation and pain they had endured for so long. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony overlooking the city, Megan turned to David with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" she asked softly. David nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "All the time. But I've learned that dwelling on the past doesn't change it. What matters is what we do with the time we have now." Megan smiled, her heart full. "You're right. And I think we've built something beautiful out of everything we've been through." David looked at her, his eyes filled with pride and love. "We have, Megan, and I couldn't be prouder of the person you've become." As the city lights twinkled below, father and daughter sat in quiet contentment, knowing they had overcome the odds and found their way back to each other. The past had shaped them, but the future was theirs to create. Together, months turned into a year, and Megan's life had transformed in ways she never imagined. The once overwhelming world of foster care advocacy had become her passion, and she found herself dedicating every ounce of her energy to supporting young people who reminded her of herself. David, too, had embraced a quieter life. His transition from the high-stakes world of business to philanthropy brought a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Together, he and Megan began planning initiatives to create lasting change. Not just for themselves, but for others who had been left behind by the system. One crisp autumn morning, Megan arrived at David's penthouse with a folder tucked under her arm. Her face was bright with excitement as she walked into the living room, where David was sipping his morning coffee. "Good morning," he greeted, setting down his cup. "You're glowing today. What's the news?" Megan grinned as she handed him the folder. "It's a proposal. I've been working on it with some of the nonprofits I've been volunteering with." David opened the folder, his eyes scanning the neatly typed pages. "A foundation?" "Yes," Megan said eagerly. "I want to create a foundation in Mom's name. Something that combines our efforts, helping foster kids, supporting young adults transitioning out of the system, and providing scholarships. We can give them the opportunities I didn't have." David looked up at her, his eyes filled with pride. "This is incredible." "Megan, your mother would be so proud." Megan's smile softened. "It's something I wish she could have seen, but I know this is a way to honor her memory and to make sure her kindness lives on." David nodded, already envisioning the possibilities. "Let's do it. Whatever you need, I'm all in." Over the next few months, the Evelyn Reynolds Foundation began to take shape. Megan threw herself into the project, meeting with partners, designing programs, and even speaking at events to share her story. Her vulnerability and authenticity inspired others, drawing support from unexpected places. David, with his business acumen and connections, ensured the foundation had the resources it needed to thrive, but he let Megan take the lead, knowing this was her vision, her way of healing and giving back. At the foundation's launch gala, held in a grand venue overlooking the city skyline, Megan stood nervously behind the curtain, clutching her speech. "You're going to be amazing," David said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Megan took a deep breath, nodding. I hope I do her justice." "You already have," David said with a smile. "Just speak from your heart. That's all you need to do." When Megan stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Hundreds of faces turned toward her, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt a deep sense of purpose. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight. This foundation isn't just about honoring my mother's memory. It's about giving hope to those who feel like the odds are stacked against them. For years, I didn't know where I came from or where I belonged. I grew up in the foster system, feeling like a piece of my story was missing. But now, I've found that missing piece, and it's given me a reason to fight for others who are searching for their place in the world." She paused, her eyes glistening with emotion. "This foundation is more than just programs and scholarships. It's a promise that no one has to face life's challenges alone. A promise that kindness, love, and support can change lives." The room erupted into applause as Megan finished, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. When she stepped down from the stage, David was waiting for her with open arms. "You were perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Megan laughed through her tears. "Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done this without you." The gala was a resounding success, raising more funds than Megan and David had anticipated. But more than that, it solidified the bond between them. Together, they were creating something that would outlast their pain, something that would carry Evelyn's legacy forward. As the months passed, Megan's work with the foundation deepened. She began mentoring more young people, seeing in them the same spark she had fought to keep alive in herself. David, meanwhile, took on a quieter role, stepping back to let Megan shine while continuing to support her in every way he could. One evening, as they sat together on the penthouse balcony, Megan looked at David with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about what Mom would say if she were here?" she asked softly. David smiled, his gaze fixed on the city lights. "All the time, and I think she'd say she's proud of you, that you've turned something so painful into something beautiful." Megan nodded, her heart full. "I think she'd be proud of us both. We've come a long way, haven't we?" David turned to her, his eyes shining with love. "We have, and we've done it together." As father and daughter sat beneath the stars, they knew their journey wasn't over, but for the first time in years, they felt a sense of peace, a belief that the pain of the past had given way to a future filled with hope, love, and purpose. The Evelyn Reynolds Foundation wasn't just a tribute to the woman they had lost. It was a testament to the resilience of a family that had been broken and rebuilt, stronger than ever. And as the city below them buzzed with life, David and Megan looked forward to the legacy they were building, one that would shine as brightly as the stars Evelyn had always loved. A year had passed since the launch of the Reynolds Foundation, and Megan's life had blossomed in ways she never imagined. The foundation had grown rapidly, touching the lives of countless young people across the city. For Megan, it wasn't just a job, it was her purpose, a way to honor her mother, and the journey that had brought her here. David, too, had found a renewed sense of purpose. Though he had stepped away from the day-to-day operations of his business empire, he poured his energy into supporting the foundation and mentoring Megan. Watching her thrive brought him a happiness he hadn't felt in decades. One sunny afternoon, Megan stood in the courtyard of a newly opened community center funded by the foundation. The building was vibrant and welcoming, its walls adorned with murals painted by local artists. Dozens of children and young adults filled the space, their laughter echoing as they explored the classrooms, workshops, and recreational areas. David arrived shortly after, stepping out of a sleek black car. He looked around, his face lighting up as he saw the joy radiating from the center. "This is incredible," he said, walking over to Megan. She turned to him with a wide smile. "It's everything I hoped it would be, a place where kids can feel safe, supported, and like they belong." David placed a hand on her shoulder, his pride evident. "You've created something truly special, Megan. Your mother would be so proud." Megan's smile softened. "We did this together. I couldn't have done it without you." As the day went on, Megan and David mingled with the attendees, sharing stories and listening to the dreams of the young people who would benefit from the center. One girl, no older than 10, approached Megan shyly, clutching a sketchbook to her chest. "Miss Megan?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Megan knelt down to her level, smiling warmly. "Hi there, what's your name?" "Emma," the girl said. "I made this for you." She handed Megan the sketchbook, and Megan opened it to find a beautifully drawn picture of a star surrounded by smaller stars. Beneath it were the words, "Thank you for giving us a place to shine." Tears welled in Megan's eyes as she looked at Emma. "This is beautiful, Emma. Thank you so much." Emma smiled brightly. "My mom says stars remind us that even when it's dark, there's always light." Megan nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. "That's exactly right, and you're one of the brightest stars here." David watched from a distance, his chest tightening with pride. Megan had not only found her purpose, but had also become a beacon of hope for others. Later that evening, back at the penthouse, Megan and David sat on the balcony, as they often did. The city lights sparkled below them, and the air was filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. "I can't believe how far we've come," Megan said, her voice filled with wonder. David smiled, sipping his tea. "You've worked hard for this, Megan, and you've turned your pain into something beautiful. That's no small feat." Megan looked at him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you. You've been my rock through everything." David reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "And you've given me a reason to live again. After losing your mother, I didn't think I'd ever find joy or purpose again, but you've brought light back into my life." Megan's voice softened. "Do you think Mom knew this would happen? That we'd find our way back to each other?" David smiled wistfully. "I like to think she did. She always believed in the strength of our family, even when things seemed impossible." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the past giving way to the peace of the present. In the months that followed, Megan and David continued to grow the foundation, expanding its reach and impact. Megan's dedication inspired others to get involved, and soon, the Reynolds Foundation became a household name, synonymous with hope and opportunity. One evening, at a gala celebrating the foundation's success, Megan took the stage to deliver a speech. She stood confidently, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "This foundation is more than a tribute to my mother. It's a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we can find light. My journey hasn't been easy, but it's taught me that love and resilience can overcome anything. My mother used to call me her little star, and today, I see stars everywhere, in the young people we've helped, in the incredible team behind this foundation, and in the future we're building together. Thank you for being part of this journey. Together, "We're making a difference." The audience erupted into applause, and Megan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. As she stepped off the stage, David was waiting for her, his face beaming with pride. "You were incredible," he said, pulling her into a hug. "Thanks, Dad," Megan said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." As the gala wound down, Megan and David found themselves alone on the balcony, looking out at the city that had been both a source of pain and healing for them. "What's next?" Megan asked, her voice tinged with excitement. David chuckled. "Whatever you want, Megan. The future is yours to shape." Megan smiled, a sense of peace settling over her. "Then let's keep going. Let's keep building something beautiful." David nodded, his heart full. Together, as the city lights shimmered below, father and daughter sat side by side, ready to embrace whatever the future held. Their journey had been long and fraught with pain, but they had found their way back to each other, stronger and more united than ever. The Evelyn Reynolds Foundation was more than a legacy. It was a testament to the resilience of love, the power of hope, and the belief that even in the darkest times light could always be found.